No, don't let him die now. Nurse Elise's scream rang out in the ICU on a snowy Boston night. Red lights flashed. The monitor blared as if signaling the end of an empire. On the hospital bed, Harrison Whitmore, the powerful media billionaire, clutched her hand tightly, whispering a secret that shattered Elise's heart. You are my blood. 20 years of caregiving. And suddenly, everything turned in that single moment. The legal family burst in, their eyes filled with horror. Would this truth heal a broken family, or push them into a brutal war? The urgent sound of rubber soles echoed along the white-lit hallway, mingling with the beeping monitors like heartbeats stretched to their breaking point. At the center of it all, a familiar figure appeared, Elise Parker, 42, head nurse of the Whitmore Hospital ICU. She didn't need to check a map or ask directions. For 20 years, every step across those cold tiles had left an invisible imprint of her presence. People often said hospitals were noisy places, full of antiseptic smells and groans of pain. But to Elise, it felt like the kitchen of an old home, familiar, lived in, the place she belonged, the place she had quietly given her life to. The fluorescent lights that often suffocated others never weighed on her. Elise walked with the calm steadiness of someone long used to facing life and death. Her black hair was tied in a neat bun, her navy blue scrubs crisp, her slightly worn shoes still polished clean. Her deep brown eyes noticed everything: the drip rate of IV fluid, the panic in a young intern's glance during their first night shift. People didn't remember her for what she said, but for her presence. Elise had never been loud. She appeared like a shadow, careful, steady, indispensable. When a patient gasped for air, when monitors screamed, when doctors still fumbled with charts, Elise was already there, adjusting the ventilator, pressing the right medication, wiping the cold sweat from a trembling forehead. Her quiet precision earned respect, but it also meant she was often forgotten. In hospitals, the doctors got remembered. Nurses rarely did. 20 years ago, after her mother's sudden death in an accident, Elise was a 30-year-old woman worn thin with grief. The job at Whitmore Hospital had come like fate itself. A recommendation letter without a signature, delivered directly to the hospital director, with only one line. She deserves a chance. Elise never discovered who wrote it. She only knew that, from her first day at Whitmore, her life became bound to one name: Harrison Whitmore. The powerful patient, the media tycoon. Everyone, from medical staff to family, tiptoed around. For 2 decades, Elise was the one constant by Harrison's bedside through heart attacks, emergency surgeries, endless sleepless nights. Not Victoria, the elegant wife draped in pearls. Not Preston, Camilla, or Benedict, the 3 legitimate children who showed up more like guests, signing forms or posing for photo ops. Harrison chose Elise, and he never explained why. The hospital staff all admitted the truth. Only Elise knew his exact medication schedule, treatment protocols, and every detail of his medical history. She was the vigilant eyes when his vitals dipped, the steady hands when a tube clogged, the witness to the frailest moments of a man the world only knew as commanding and untouchable. There were times when Harrison opened his eyes in feverish confusion, saw Elise, and simply calmed down. Yet, in the eyes of the Whitmore family, she was just an employee, a quiet black woman, convenient for cleaning, for standing with a clipboard waiting for orders. Victoria ordered Elise to fetch her coffee. Camila swatted her away for suggesting less makeup in the ICU. Preston sneered, "If you're so skilled, why are you still just a nurse?" And Benedict, in drunken slurs, often called her the nameless shadow in our hospital. Elise never retaliated. To her, hospitals weren't battlefields for arguments. They were spaces to work quietly, to witness quietly, to exist quietly. But that very silence raised questions. Why would a woman like her, smart, devoted, highly skilled, choose to spend 20 years tied to the sickbed of a frail billionaire? What had kept her tethered to the shadows of the Whitmore family for so long? And then, on a winter night, when alarms shrieked through the ICU, the truth began to leak out, a secret powerful enough to change everything. If those 2 decades of devotion weren't just duty, but blood, what would happen when the truth came to light? And before we continue with the next chapter of this story, don't forget to subscribe and like this video. Oh, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to know. The alarm shattered the silence of a December night. Red lights flashed violently along the ICU corridor, painting the cold white walls with a glow that felt like the end of the world. Harrison Whitmore, the man who once shook the American media empire, now lay crumpled against pristine sheets, his chest heaving like a sinking ship. The jagged spikes of his heartbeat on the monitor dipped, then fell, dragging the beeps into a frantic chorus that left young nurses pale with fear. But in the chaos, Elise surged forward as if her body had been programmed for these emergencies. She pushed oxygen, adjusted machines, signaled Dr. Hayes, every move flowing into the next. To Elise, death wasn't a stranger. It was a familiar guest she'd stood beside through 2 decades of night shifts. Dr. Hayes, tall and broad with salt and pepper hair pressed down on Harrison's chest, sweat tracing lines along his temple. He muttered the count under his breath as the entire room held its breath, waiting for the green line to rise again. Elise, standing at the bedside, her eyes fixed on Harrison's every tremor, suddenly felt his trembling hand grip her wrist. Weak, but deliberate. She froze. Between life and death, Harrison's eyes cracked open, silver-gray irises glinting with a rare clarity. He pulled Elise closer, gasping, words ragged yet sharp. "You are my daughter. I have lived in mistake all my life." Time stopped. Elise went numb, blood roaring in her ears until every sound grew distant. The beeping monitors fading into background hum, the scuffle of running shoes muffled like echoes in a dream. Only his cold hand clasping hers, and the confession slicing through 20 years of silence, remained real. Dr. Hayes faltered mid-compression, stunned, nearly losing rhythm. His eyes shot up to Elise as if he'd just witnessed fate turn a corner. And before Elise could even begin to process, the ICU doors burst open. Victoria stormed in first, heels pounding against the tile, her fur coat sweeping across the floor like a shadow swallowing the light. Behind her came Preston, Camilla, and Benedict, the 3 legitimate heirs, their faces pale with fear and a glint of curiosity. They stared at the scene, Harrison gripping Elise's hand, Elise standing frozen, her face ashen. In the suffocating tension, Preston broke first, his voice cracking with fury. He's delirious from morphine, a desperate attempt to smother a nightmare before it grew. But Harrison, lungs collapsing, breath rattling, summoned what strength remained. His voice, jagged yet iron, cut through the room with a finality no one had heard in years. "Elise Parker is my blood." The air shattered like glass. Victoria staggered, her crimson lips trembling as if struck. Camilla clutched her handbag, eyes wide with betrayal. Benedict, quieter than the rest, stood rigid, hands buried in his pockets but his stare locked on Elise, searching, weighing, demanding truth. Elise's heart pounded, but not from the alarm. 20 years of long shifts, bowed silence under disdain, swallowed pride. All of it erupted into lightning, tearing open the hospital night. She wanted to believe, yet couldn't. How could she? A secret buried for decades, now hurled into the world at the edge of death. In a flash, she saw herself 2 decades earlier, the young woman at her mother's funeral, hands shaking as she held that strange unsigned recommendation letter that opened the path to Whitmore Hospital. And now, like a circle closing, Harrison's confession hurled her into the storm at the center of the Whitmore dynasty. The ICU still pulsed with machine alarms, but everyone in the room knew. The line between life and death had just given way to another line, the one between truth and lies. And once truth is spoken, it cannot be taken back. If Harrison wasn't delirious, if Elise truly was his blood, then power, fortune, and the very future of the Whitmore family were about to be torn apart. All right then, my dear audience, if you're still here and finding this story gripping, Comment one or say, "I'm still here to keep listening." The morning frost of Boston had not yet lifted when the top floor of Whitmore Hospital filled with heavy footsteps. No more flashing red lights, no more blaring alarms like the night before, yet the air was thick, as if even the brick walls knew they were witnessing a point of no return. In a small conference room next to the ICU, Dr. Hayes placed a sealed brown envelope on the table, every eye fixed on it, as though it held not just papers, but the fate of an entire family. Jonathan Pierce, Harrison's longtime attorney, opened the envelope with gloved hands. Inside lay the DNA results, kept locked away in a safe for months, stamped with the blazing red seal of the National Laboratory. The paper quivered under the neon light as he read aloud. The results matched perfectly. Harrison Whitmore was the biological father of Elise Parker. No margin of error. No room for denial. The room froze into silence. Victoria pressed her hand against the table, nails tapping the polished wood, her eyes turning to stone. Her meticulously painted face, flawless lipstick, twisted now in shock. Preston, known for his temper, roared and slammed his palm down, sending a coffee cup spinning to the floor, shattering into brown stains. Camila, wrapped in a designer coat, burst into sobs, mascara streaking black rivers across her cheeks. To them, it was as if they were watching a play gone absurd, where the lead role had suddenly fallen into the hands of the woman they had dismissed for 2 decades. Elise sat upright at the far end of the table, saying nothing. Her face was pale, yet her eyes burned with an unusual light. Amid Camila's sobs and Preston's furious mutters, she remained still. It was as if all the humiliation she had swallowed for 20 years had finally spoken for itself. Attorney Pierce went on. Alongside the DNA report was a copy of Elise's old birth certificate hastily altered, the father's name conspicuously absent. Then came faded prenatal records, Whitmore's name printed faintly in the corner, abandoned as though meant to be buried. And finally, a long list of anonymous transfers, steady annual payments, enough to cover tuition and living expenses, yet carefully disguised to never reveal their source. The ink on the page might as well have been droplets of blood trickling year by year to keep a hidden bond alive between Harrison and Elise. Victoria clutched her pearl necklace so tightly it dug into her skin, her lips trembling as if searching for a crack in the rising tide of truth. Preston shouted, voice hoarse, "This is fake. All of it a cheap fabrication." But Pierce, who had served the Whitmore dynasty for over 30 years, merely slid his glasses down the bridge of his nose and stared at him. It was a look that permitted no argument. Camila collapsed into a chair, her shoulders quaking with anger and despair. Benedict, the quietest of the 3 siblings, did not lash out. He sat motionless, eyes fixed on Elise, as though suddenly piecing together fragments he had ignored for years. Something about her steady care, her silent presence, now made undeniable sense. The air was so heavy, each breath felt like lifting stone. A question hung above them all. If Elise was truly Harrison's child, did she now have a voice in his medical decisions? And further still, would she stand as the rightful heir to nearly $900 million, wealth that Victoria and the children had long taken for granted as theirs? While Victoria's eyes flickered rapidly, calculating escape routes, while Preston shouted and Camila wept, Elise simply sat in silence yet defiant. At last, after 20 years, she no longer needed to speak to be seen. The papers, the seals, the truth itself spoke for her. But while evidence could persuade a court, what about the hearts and the power of the Whitmore family? Would the truth be strong enough to withstand the fury of a dynasty preparing to strike back? The sharp staccato of high heels struck the cold tile floor like nails hammering a coffin shut. The ICU corridor, usually filled with the steady roll of stainless steel carts and the distant beeping of monitors, suddenly transformed into a makeshift courtroom. On the metal benches lining the wall, a few patients waiting for exams lifted their heads, watching with curiosity, as if witnessing a live drama unfolding before their eyes. Victoria Whitmore stood tall, her fox fur coat flung to one side, eyes blazing with fury. Her voice shrill and cutting, overpowered even the intercom calling for nurses. "You're just a nurse." You're not family. The words sliced like knives, aimed not only at Elise but meant to drown the DNA evidence, read aloud that very morning. Elise did not move. For 20 years, she had trained herself to keep her breathing steady while holding a syringe, to keep her hands firm when blood poured from an incision. And now, she held her composure against the storm of words. Her hair was tied neatly back, her navy scrubs plain, yet her gaze burned with fire. For the first time in 2 decades, she spoke, her voice husky but resolute. I was the one beside him when you were at parties. Who is the real family? Silence stretched, long enough for the tick of the hallway clock to echo. Preston cursed, fumbling for his phone to call his lawyer, his hands trembling as if he could summon an army of attorneys to erase the truth. Camila clutched her face, shaking her head over and over, muttering, "Impossible," like a mantra. Mascara streaked down her cheeks, leaving her looking like a melting cubist painting. And then, unexpectedly, Benedict, the quiet youngest son, broke the chaos with a single sentence, soft yet heavy as stone. She has his eyes. Head snapped toward him, disbelief rippling through the corridor at what sounded like betrayal. But Benedict did not look at his mother or siblings, his gaze fixed on Elise, lingering longer than necessary, as if to remind her that amid the sea of denial, someone had seen the truth all along. The tension was taut, a string ready to snap. Passers-by slowed their steps, some pretending to read the bulletin board just to stay and listen. A young nurse nudged her colleague, whispering, "This is like a Netflix show." By chance, the corridor had become a stage where words carried the weight of verdicts. Elise felt heat rise through her chest, but instead of trembling, she stood taller, gripping the patient file in her hand as if it were her very life. For 20 years, she had bowed under scorn, stayed silent through ridicule. Now every beat of her heart pounded like a drum, urging her that the time had come to speak the truth not only through DNA results, but through her very existence. At the end of the corridor, Attorney Pierce watched quietly. Legally, he knew the tide had turned toward Elise, but emotionally, the battle was far from won. In families like the Whitmores, law was never the only force at play. Pride, power, and reputation cut sharper than any Red Seal document. And so, the question hung heavy over them all. Who truly had the right to sign Harrison's medical directives if his condition worsened? Victoria, the legal wife with her string of pearls, or Elise, the daughter confirmed by DNA but never once called child by the family? And if that right fell into Elise's hands, what would happen to the vast fortune hanging like a double-edged sword over the fate of the entire Whitmore dynasty? The clang of a steel cart echoed down the tile floor, the harsh glare of surgical lights reflecting off the black leather folder Jonathan Pierce clutched in his hands. People often thought the most defining moments of life happened in courtrooms or boardrooms, but that night, in the cramped ICU smelling sharply of antiseptic, a new will was opened like a blade cutting straight through the heart of the Whitmore dynasty. Harrison lay half-propped against crisp white sheets, his chest heaving as if every breath were its own battle. His lips were pale and trembling, yet the silver gray in his eyes still flickered with the command of a man long accustomed to ruling an empire. Attorney Pierce opened the folder, his low voice steady in the tense room. According to wishes prepared months in advance, he turned the first page, revealing a medical power of attorney. Elise froze, the floor seeming to slide beneath her. Her hand shook as Pierce guided the pen to Harrison's fingers. With what little strength remained, Harrison forced his spine straight, his arm trembling but resolute. The signature scratched across the page, shaky, heavy, but unmistakable. From that moment, Elise Parker held sole authority over all medical decisions regarding him. A right that had always belonged to Victoria slipped from her grasp in plain view. The air thickened. Victoria shot to her feet, voice shrill. Impossible. Her string of pearls rattled with each tremor, her eyes sharp enough to shred the paper in Pierce's hand. Preston slammed his palm against the bed rail, veins bulging with fury. Camila dabbed at streaming tears, mascara smeared into dark streaks across her cheeks. Benedict sat quietly, leaned back in his chair, as if he had long foreseen this outcome. Pierce turned to the thick sheaf of documents, the new will. His tone was measured, but every word fell like a gavel. The bulk of Harrison's fortune, nearly $900 million, was left to Elise Parker, his now legally recognized daughter. The legitimate children would each receive a $5 million trust fund, enough to sustain a comfortable life without the burden of power. The reading reverberated like a hammer striking a judge's bench. Elise didn't blink. For 2 decades, she had been nothing more than the shadow at his bedside. Now, in black and white, she was named the heir. No defense, no justification, only truth laid bare. Power had changed hands. Victoria collapsed into her chair, clutching her pearls as if they were the last anchor she possessed. Preston shouted into his phone, frantically summoning his own lawyers. Camilla buried her face in her hands, her smudged makeup turning her features into a dripping canvas. Only Benedict, calm yet sorrowful, fixed his gaze on Elise, seeing in her the reflection of their father himself. Harrison turned his head, forcing one final breath to whisper, "Prepared months ago, all legal." Then his hand fell slack, his weary head sinking into the pillow, eyes fluttering shut. The room drowned in silence. The heart monitor still drew jagged lines on the screen, but everyone understood, whether his heart kept beating or not, Harrison had already delivered his verdict. With one frail signature, he had handed both his medical authority and his empire to the daughter hidden for decades. But would that trembling signature be enough to withstand the furious counterattack of a wife and legitimate heirs who had never once imagined letting go of the Whitmore throne? My dear audience, are you still with me? Take a moment to sip some water, breathe, and if you find this story gripping, drop a comment with the number 1 below. And don't forget to hit subscribe, because the next chapter will only grow more explosive. The hospital room lay shrouded in the dim glow of wall lamps. Outside, Boston was swallowed in a winter night, snow falling silently against the glass, isolating the space from the world. Harrison lay on the bed, his breathing heavy, chest rising and falling as if fighting off relentless waves. Elise sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly, not out of fear, but because she sensed a truth was about to surface, one powerful enough to change her life forever. He stirred, his trembling hand groping for something, and Elise bent down to hold it. In that instant, father and daughter touched for the first time in a bond that felt vital, unbreakable. Harrison looked at her, eyes weary but filled with determination, and began to speak in a rasping, fractured voice, each word like a final confession from a man carrying too much. 20 years ago, at the height of his power, Harrison met Rosalind, a young woman with a clear smile and warm brown eyes. They had crossed paths at a charity gala, where Rosalind was a volunteer pouring wine. In her simple dress, she didn't shine the way society women did, but her quiet grace drew him in. Among furs and pearls, she was a small flame that warmed the entire room. The affair came suddenly, fierce and dangerous. Harrison admitted that in Rosalind's arms he had found a peace power could never buy. But that peace terrified him. He feared Victoria, his wife, with her political connections, would discover the truth. He feared the media empire he had built would collapse if scandal reached the press. Above all, he feared losing the respect of a society that treated honor as currency. When Rosalind became pregnant, fear hardened into cruelty. He confessed he had given her a large sum of money, demanding she leave and disappear from the Whitmore world. In return, he promised to watch from afar, words that sounded like comfort but were nothing more than cowardice. Elise sat frozen, every word piercing her heart. Images of her mother surfaced, the gentle woman who always masked sadness with a smile, who avoided every question about her father. Whenever Elise asked, she would only say, "You already have everything you need. Just live well." Now, Elise understood. It wasn't a lie, but a sacrifice. Her mother had chosen silence so her daughter wouldn't grow up in hatred. Harrison continued, his voice breaking with every pause. He spoke of paying hospital bills when Elise fell sick, of anonymous tuition envelopes at her school, even of the mysterious recommendation letter that opened the doors of Whitmore Hospital for her. All of it, his doing. Yet never once had he stepped into the light. "I was a coward," he whispered. "I let my daughter grow up as a stranger, while I sat at glittering banquets." Elise bowed her head, hot tears falling onto his hand. For 20 years she had lived like a shadow, haunted by the feeling of unseen eyes watching her. Now she knew the eyes belonged to her father. Part of her wanted to scream, to rage that no confession could erase decades of pain. But deep inside, a child within her still longed for acknowledgement, for an embrace, for proof she was not invisible. In a rare moment of weakness, Harrison squeezed her hand, the deep lines of his skin like a map of lies and regrets. "You deserved recognition from the very start," he choked. "I was wrong. But if time remains, I want to make it right." Elise closed her eyes. The monitor beeped steadily, each note a reminder of time slipping away. She did not answer, letting her tears fall, tears of both forgiveness and resistance. Outside the window, snow blanketed the city, a cold shroud hiding decades of secrets. But would the truth about Rosalind and 20 years of guilt be enough to mend the bond between father and daughter, or would it only deepen the cracks within the Whitmore family beyond repair? The steady beeping of the monitor echoed through the dim hospital room, slow and fragile like the ticking of a clock counting down. Harrison Whitmore, the man who once stood tall at press conferences under blinding flashes, now lay in a deep coma. His eyelids shut tight, his gaunt face bore the weight of years spent balancing power with regret. On the screen, the jagged green line still moved, but faintly like a thread suspended between life and death. Elise sat close, her hands gripping her father's as it grew colder. She bent down, whispering one word, "Daddy," the first time in her life she had ever spoken it. The sound was small, fragile, but it filled the void of 2 decades. A single word, yet for Elise it was the culmination of blood and tears. Her tears fell onto the back of his hand, mingling with the deep wrinkles carved by years of remorse. Out in the hallway, the world of the elite carried on in its familiar noise: lawyers, documents, paperwork. Victoria sat rigid in her chair, posture as perfect as if she were still at a gala. She whispered to her attorney, her voice icy, "We'll prove he's incompetent." Every signature is invalid. Papers flipped sharply, and the whir of a portable printer filled the air like the opening volley of a legal war. Preston stormed back and forth, his voice raised louder than necessary, not just for the lawyer to hear, but for the entire hallway to witness his fury. He flung his arms, hammering his words as if anger itself could be evidence. Camila, her mascara still smeared from the night before, hunched over her phone, fingers flying across the screen. She fired off furious emails to partners and social circles. "This is a mistake. Elise will never replace us." She turned her fear into propaganda, a politician in training. Only Benedict stood apart from the chaos. Leaning against the window frame, his eyes followed the snow drifting outside. In a rare moment, he murmured not to anyone, but to himself, "We treated her like trash for 20 years. No one responded, no one wanted to hear it. But the words dropped heavy as stone, reverberating in a space already cracked and fragile. Inside the room, Elise remained by her father's bedside, sheltered from the storm beyond the door. She knew that from this moment forward, every decision could ignite a drawn-out legal battle. The $900 million inheritance was no longer just a figure, it was a battlefield, where love, greed, and justice collided. She looked at her father's face, gently smoothing his disheveled silver hair, and wondered, was this his final gift of love, or a millstone tied around her neck? A draft slipped through the doorframe, making the pale green curtain tremble. Elise raised her head, eyes swollen with tears, but burning with clarity. For the first time, she no longer felt like a shadow. But to withstand Victoria and the legitimate heirs, she would need more than truth. She would need strength enough to turn late-found love into a legacy. Would Elise be strong enough to hold on to both love and fortune? Or would this inheritance only mark the beginning of a bitter legal war destined to last for years? The dim light of the hospital room blended with the steady beeping of the monitor, like the fragile melody of a song left unfinished. Harrison Whitmore lay in a coma, but what he left behind had already shaken the entire dynasty. A will, a truth, a belated confession. Elise sat at his side, her hand still clutching his, seeing herself for the first time no longer invisible. Beyond the door, a world of power was already stirring, ready to turn that late-bloomed love into a calculated legal war. This story makes us ask, what is the true legacy? Is it the numbers in a bank account, or the moment a child finally hears her father call her with love? Harrison may leave behind wealth, but the greatest value is the lesson that truth, even when it comes late, still holds the power to heal. And that's sometimes the courage to say, "You are my blood" matters more than all the power in the world. But the door has not closed. Victoria and the legitimate children have vowed not to surrender. Elise, once the silent nurse, is now at the very center of the storm. Will she be strong enough to hold on to the legacy of love? Or will it all turn into a battlefield that drags on for years? Will Benedict, the only child who dared to recognize the truth, take a stand, and on which side? And Harrison, will he wake in time to hear his daughter call him daddy once more? Dear viewers, if this story has touched your heart, share it with your family and friends in the United States, so together we can spread its message of truth, love, and courage. Don't forget to leave a comment below with your thoughts on Elise and the Whitmore dynasty. What do you believe will happen in part 2? Will this be the beginning of a new family, or the opening of a never-ending legal war? Tell us your perspective. And if you want to stay with this journey, don't leave, because what's coming next will be even more dramatic and moving.